Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today I'm sharing 3 techniques to try with alcohol inks and press plates. I love working with alcohol inks and I always love finding different ways to use them. I also love working with my Betterpress and love using my press plates in different ways. I have these 3 plates here that I'm going to use today. Spellbinders sent them to me to create with and share with you. And I hope that throughout this video, you are inspired and learn different ways to use your press plates in just unique ways. I always think that with tools, the more ways we can use them, the more valuable they are. So I'm working on some Yupo paper here first. Yupo paper is a synthetic paper, so it's a plastic paper, and it's a perfect surface for alcohol inks. I'm only using regular alcohol ink, so I'm using isopropyl alcohol to spread it around, and I have it in a mister bottle as well as a dropper bottle. I'm putting different colors of the alcohol inks on that Yupo, and then I'm going to use an alcohol ink blower tool in order to blow that ink around and blend it around. And I quickly abandon the one on the right and work on the one on the left and then go do the one on the right. Doing 2 at a time was a little bit ambitious, and I knew that as I was putting the inks down, but you get to a point where you have to go with it. So the pieces of Yupo paper that I have here are 5 inches by 8 inches. I just took a sheet from that package and cut it in half. I wanted to make sure that my pieces were large enough to get a good surface, and then I could cut them down. I didn't want to be stuck with something that was smaller than what I really wanted. So by having a large piece, I can cut that down to what I want later on, and I can also use those extra bits. So the colors that I'm using today, I'm just choosing 4 colors. I have boysenberry, fiesta, lettuce, and citrus. And by using that alcohol ink blower, I can blend it as much or as little as I want. What I'm trying to do here is not have too many areas that are thick and dark and sticky. And if you've ever worked with alcohol inks before, you'll know that it is kind of easy as you're working with them to start getting those areas. I want to use this as a surface to use some alcohol lift ink. And by having those areas that are really thick and sticky, I find that the lift ink doesn't lift as well in those areas. Now, if I was using a stamp here, it would be not really a huge deal because I could go back over it, try to lift some more. But because I'm doing this with the Betterpress, I have basically one shot to do it. So I'm trying to avoid those areas as much as possible. Now there is a few areas that you can't avoid. It's just going to happen. They just dry up too quick. And sometimes I like those areas, so I don't want to rehydrate them with the isopropyl alcohol and ruin that. Once I have the piece to the left to a point where I like it, I'm taking the same alcohol ink colors and I'm kind of doing stripes on the piece of the right. And then I'm using my alcohol ink or isopropyl in the dropper bottle and doing stripes of the isopropyl and then using the alcohol ink blower to blow it around. Now, I don't have gloves on my hands. My hands are going to get stained from the alcohol ink. If that bothers you, wear some rubber gloves. I highly recommend you wear them if you don't want your hands to get stained. We don't have a dishwasher, so I am hand washing dishes multiple times a day. So typically when I get my hands stained, it doesn't last too long because basically I'm washing them many times a day. So once I blew that around with the alcohol ink blower tool, I just lift it up with my fingers, and this is really where most of the alcohol gets on my fingers. Again, doesn't bother me, but if it bothers you, way to prevent it is very easy, and it's just wearing some rubber gloves or latex gloves. After I have lifted it up and moved those around a little bit, I take that blower tool and just break up some of the thicker areas. I like having those stripes there, but I don't want a lot of areas that are really thick and sticky. This one I'm also using that lift ink for, and I want to make sure that I can move or remove as much of that as possible. That top part there, I wanted to have a little bit more of the green. Now, obviously, this technique is going to work with whatever alcohol ink colors you choose. I chose ones that were going to look best, in my opinion, with those press plates because they're a little bit florally. But you can do whatever you're wanting. as I was looking at the one on the left, I decided I want a little bit more greens in that background. So I just put one of the green colors down, some isopropyl on top of it, and then the alcohol ink blower tool to blow it. Now, the cool thing with alcohol inks is when you put a different color over top of another, it kind of pushes it out of the way. It does blend to a point, but I love the fact that it kind of pushes those colors out of the way, and it reacts just differently than other inks. It's one of those inks that you have a tiny bit of control, and most of it is just what it's going to do. If there's an area that you find is a little bit too dark, you can use that isopropyl alcohol to lighten it up. But I wanted to have really bright colors here. I find the lift ink works better. Well, really not works better. It shows up more when you have dark and bright colors. So once I was done my backgrounds there, I let them dry overnight. I had done that first part at night, so this is the next morning. You don't necessarily have to wait that long, but you do want to make sure that your alcohol ink is completely dry. So I'm taping those pieces of Yupo into my Betterpress. Now I'm just kind of centering it on there, and then I'm putting my Betterpress plate on the Betterpress. Now we're going to get a reverse image here, so I'm purposely putting it towards the right side because when I'm done, I want it to be towards the left side. So if that's something that you are concerned about, you want to place your plate accordingly. I'm using that alcohol lift ink pad and generously inking that background and then putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. You need to put it through the die cutting machine for the pressure, and it just presses that ink right onto the plate. When I pull this off, you can't really see what it did. You will see it in a minute. This piece here I'm going to put aside for a few moments, and then I'm taking a piece of alcohol ink cardstock and taping that into my Betterpress. So the alcohol lift ink pad lifts alcohol ink up off of a non-porous surface. So that ink is now sitting on that Betterpress plate, and I want to press it into some paper. The one that I find it shows up best on is alcohol ink cardstock. It's a clay-coated paper that has a glossy finish to it, and it just looks beautiful with alcohol inks. You could print it onto regular cardstock, but regular cardstock with alcohol inks tends to look a little bit dull. Now that second print is done, I can remove the alcohol ink lift ink from my first print. So what I do is a clean paper towel and I blot it a couple times. Typically I do this about 4 times. And then once that's blotted, you can start rubbing and removing more of the ink. You want to take any of that excess ink off before rubbing, otherwise you're just going to smear that ink off of there. So for this plate, the result is quite subtle. And part of that I think is because I had all sorts of different colors all over the place. I love the look of it, but with the next one, I think you see the color a little bit more. Now I just took my isopropyl alcohol with my mister and just cleaned off all of that alcohol ink that might have been left on the plate, just so that I know that it's clean for the next time I want to use it. I took my alcohol ink cardstock, the glossy cardstock, out of the package so it's ready for the next time and I'm not having to wait. And then I'm repeating that same process. So I'm inking up my Betterpress plate with the alcohol lift ink pad, putting my Yupo paper on top of my clear plate, taping that in place, and then putting the two together and putting it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine. I love the fact that the Betterpress system has magnets in place, so it holds that plate there, and I don't have to worry about anything shifting or moving. I also am not worried about my first print drying up. That ink can sit there for a few minutes while I print the second one. It's a little bit more awkward with a Betterpress plate than it is when you're doing, say, a stamp, but it works perfectly. And you'll notice I go back and forth with that Betterpress plate or the base in my Platinum 6. I just want to make sure to get as much of that ink down as possible. Now that I have the ink printed on the glossy cardstock, I am blotting it off of the Yupo paper. This time I'm making sure to do it 4 times. I want to try press and lift up as much of that ink as possible. And then once that's done, I go in a circular motion and buff it. And you can see when you go in a circular motion, you really do start to remove more of that ink. I love the uniqueness of these backgrounds. I think they look so cool, and I think it'll make some really cool backgrounds for cards. But before I get to working with cards, I want to create some embellishments for those cards. So I'm taking the flower stems plate, and I'm setting them up so that they are ready to go on my Betterpress base. I'm trying to get 3 flowers in here, and what I'm keeping in mind is this base has marks for an A2 as well as an A7. I'm trying to keep everything within that A2 because that is the size of my glossy cardstock. And when I go to print that, I want to make sure that I have enough room for the halo that happens when you die cut these images. So I have another piece of 5 inches by 8 inches Yupo paper, and I'm doing the same method as the second piece from the first section, or from the first 2 that I did. I'm just trying to create stripes of color. I'm wanting to cut the flowers and print the flowers from this, so I really would like the purple and the pink at the top and the green at the bottom so that I have purple and pink flowers and green stems. If I get a little bit of green in the flowers, I'm not worried. If I get a little bit of pink in the leaves, I'm not worried, but I just kind of want to get that feel for it. I'm doing exactly the same process as the first. I lifted it up a little bit to move those colors around, and then I used my alcohol ink blower tool to spread it a little bit more and then let it dry completely. Now that that is done, I have my Yupo alcohol inked cardstock in my Betterpress, and you'll notice this time I taped it in a little bit lower. I want to leave a section at the bottom there to do something different with the Betterpress plate. So I'm only printing towards the top, and I'm leaving an area to do another technique with. Once that is done and I've lifted or put that lift ink on that background, I taped in my glossy cardstock and printed that, and it looks really, really cool, the color transition between the different ones there. Now that that glossy cardstock is printed, I'm using my paper towel, my clean paper towel, and pressing down and blotting up any of the lift ink that happens to be there. And once I've done that 4 times, I will go in with a clean area and I will go in a circular motion and buff and remove any of that excess ink. And you can see when you do that, that just really brightens up. So there are my 2 floral prints. Now, this Yupo paper die cuts just like cardstock. It die cuts beautifully. And before I do the technique I want to do on that area that I've left blank, I am going to die cut my flowers. I don't want a chance that I do that next technique over top of one of these flowers here. So I tape that die in place, and then I will put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine and die cut that out. You do want to make sure to tape these dies in place just to make sure that they don't shift on you. It's far too easy for it to move, and this way you know that you have the placement that you are wanting when you're die cutting. So put that through there, and like I said, it die cuts beautifully. The only time I've ever had an issue die cutting Yupo paper is if it's a really, really intricate die, then sometimes it has a few problems, but a simple shape like this, it has no problem with. So once I have those die cut and set to the side, I'm taping this piece right back onto the clear plate of the Betterpress, making sure that that is not going to move. And then I'm taking the Betterpress ink and I'm inking that remaining plate on there. So we're having the colored background here on the Yupo, and I'm using that Betterpress ink and I'm going to print that flower in black on there. You can do this technique however you want. I just wanted you to be able to see what happened when you did the lift ink or what happened when you did the Betterpress ink. Both will work and both create completely different results. When I use the Betterpress ink, I like to use Ranger Archival Ink Remover to clean off the ink on my plates. The Betterpress ink is a formula of archival ink made by Ranger, so it cleans it off beautifully, and I can make sure that I don't have any ink residue left on there, possibly contaminating a future project. I'm going to move all of that stuff out of the way. I am going to leave this flower to dry for a few minutes. Because that Yupo cardstock, I put my die down and then I just changed my mind and decided to wait a moment. Because that Yupo paper is plastic, the ink takes a little bit longer to dry. And here is those 3 versions of the flower. The alcohol ink lift from the Yupo or the Betterpress putting that ink back on the glossy cardstock, and then the black Betterpress ink on that alcohol ink background. Another thing you'll want to do is you might get a little bit of alcohol ink transferring to your cutting plates when you are die cutting. So make sure to clean off those plates before you put your machine away. We don't want to ruin a future project with a little bit of that alcohol ink. Now I've laid out all my cards that I'm going to make with this technique, and I am gluing them together. I'm using some Barely Art glue. I have it in a nice fine tip bottle so I can be very precise with my ink. And just like the archival ink, you want to make sure to let this dry for just a little bit longer than cardstock. Because it's synthetic, it doesn't absorb and dry quite as quickly. So I do leave it to dry for a little bit longer. And this is the result from these cards here. I absolutely love how vibrant and beautiful the results are with alcohol ink. And I think they look absolutely gorgeous with those Betterpress plates. For my next technique, I want to use some clear Duralar. So Duralar, if you've never used it before, you can stamp and emboss on it. It is heat resistant. Now that doesn't mean heat proof. You do need to be careful when you're embossing, but it is resistant, so you still can emboss on it. So I'm putting my Cosmos Backdrop Betterpress plate on the Betterpress system, and this time I'm using a Versamark pad to ink my plate. I'm going to put that through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine and press that image or that Versamark image onto the Duralar. Now I did use an embossing powder tool on the Duralar because I want to make sure that that embossing powder only sticks to the ink that's transferred and not to the plastic. Once I've put that through, I can take that off of the clear plate and I can put some embossing powder on there. I'm choosing to do just black powder for the technique that I'm doing, but you could choose whatever color you want. However, I am using this with alcohol ink. So when I go to put the alcohol ink on there, you're not going to see any alcohol ink that happens to go on the embossing. Whereas if you were to use, say, a silver or a gold or a white, you would see that. So for this technique that I'm doing, it probably looks best with black, but there's no reason why you couldn't do it with something else. But you will see the alcohol ink on top of that embossing, and it will likely not look as nice. So just keep that in mind. So when I am embossing this Duralar, I am being careful. I'm making sure to move that heat gun around. If you sit that heat gun on one area for too long, the Duralar does start to warp. And even with this, there's a slight amount of warping, but not a ton. I have a little dish here that I'm going to put some alcohol ink. You can just use a plate. I could use the side of my glass mat here. This just keeps it in one spot and makes it easy to see exactly what's in there in order to paint this alcohol ink on the Duralar. The brushes that I'm using are actually disposable eyeliner brushes. They're perfect for this. They come in with a ton of them in the pack. You'll see it's listed and linked down in the description below. They can be reused with the same color. I do keep them and I check what color it is. This just saves having to clean out a brush. I find when you use a brush with alcohol ink, you can clean it off with isopropyl alcohol, but you end up going through a whole lot of isopropyl alcohol just to get that brush completely clean. And this way I can just keep a brush for pinks and purples, and you can see that I'm using that same brush with both the pink and purple. The colors are similar enough that I'm not going to muddy or ruin any colors, and it's really easy to hold. It's comfortable to hold and easy to paint with. So once I have done each one of the flowers, I let them dry completely. I only put a little bit of alcohol ink in that dish because it does start to evaporate quite quickly, and if you put a lot in there, you're going to end up wasting a lot. So just a few drops, and then if you need some more, you can always put a little bit more in your dish. I'm trying to keep the one color on the center of the flower and another color for the outside edge of the flower, but you can see that those two colors are fairly similar. You don't see a whole lot of difference between the two of them. You could also just do a solid flower. You don't necessarily have to do this with two different colors. I just like the look of it. Now, if you happen to get any ink outside of your embossed edges, I will show you how to clean that up later once we are done the whole image. This alcohol ink will dry fairly quickly, and you do want to do this with an embossed image because that embossing creates a little bit of a ridge. So it's going to help that alcohol ink stay where you want it to go. If you just stamped this and then did this on the back of the Duralar, that alcohol ink would just spread and flow and there would be nothing to stop it. Alcohol ink tends to kind of just do what it wants. So you do want to make sure that you do this with an embossed image so that it does have something to stop it to keep that color. For the inside of those flowers, I'm just using some black. I'm putting it towards the edges and then just kind of blending it towards the center. I don't want this center to be super, super black. And I will go in when I'm cleaning things up and I will lift some of that off just to kind of create a little bit of a highlight in the center of the flower. For the leaves, I'm using the same two colors that I used for the first part of the technique, or the first technique. I'm using lettuce and citrus. And then for those flowers, the colors were exactly the same as the beginning. So I used boysenberry and fiesta. I'm doing the same technique with the leaves that I did with the flowers, but for this I'm going over the entire leaf with the lightest color, and then I'm going to take the darkest color and just dot it where I want a shadow to be. So there would be a shadow where the leaf goes behind the flower. There would be a shadow where, or I put a shadow at the base of the leaf, and sometimes on the top of this there's a leaf that flips over. There would be a shadow underneath there as well. These two colors of green, again, there's not a ton of difference between them, but I do want a little bit of lighter areas and darker areas just to give a little bit of interest and variety. So the tiny, tiny leaves, I just go in with the lightest green, and I'm using the same brush for both greens. There's no need to have another brush just for two different shades of a very similar color. You can see how quickly it is to color this entire image. It goes really, really quickly, and you can clean your brush off in between if you need to by just putting it on some scrap paper. The only reason I'm working on scrap paper here is because this way I can see the colors. I can see exactly what I have done in what sections and what I've missed. If I were to do this on my black glass mat here, it's really hard to see those colors. I'd have to constantly be lifting it up to see that. So grabbing a piece of scrap paper to go underneath there, you can see how your colors are blending. You can see exactly how it's going to look on the front of your card. And it's a great surface, and I always have a bunch of scrap paper to go and just grab for things like this. It's a handy thing to have, and I typically will just use kind of off prints from my printer. I don't use new paper for this. I reuse stuff that would normally have gotten recycled. It's perfect use for this and a great way to see exactly where you've painted, what the colors look like, and whatnot. Once your image is completely painted, it's time to clear off any areas where it might have seeped outside of the lines. And I'm using these little dentist tools. They're actually, I'm not even sure what they're called. Again, they'll be listed and linked in the description. They're great for alcohol ink art, for dotting, for just adding texture. But for this, I'm just picking up just a little bit of isopropyl alcohol and reconstituting any of the alcohol ink that might have gone outside the lines and then dried up. Now, this isn't going to remove a ton of that color because this little tip here is so tiny, it can only absorb so much. So if you wanted to remove that color completely, the best thing to do would be to take this isopropyl alcohol with this tool, put it on the area, and then use a paper towel to blot it up. For some of these areas, there's just a tiny little bit, so just rehydrating it and spreading it around is enough. But some of the areas are a little bit more concentrated, and you can really see if you do that. So by rehydrating it like I'm doing here and then taking a paper towel and just lifting that up, it cleans it up really quite nicely. And because this little tool here is so tiny, you can be fairly precise with it. It also doesn't pick up a ton of isopropyl alcohol, so you don't have to worry about rehydrating too much and spreading it around. Once that is done, I set that aside to dry completely. And I have the Spellbinders Matting Basics die set here that I'm using to create a window on the front of my card. I've chosen two different ones to create a black frame around my Duralar piece. Now, you could put this Duralar right on the front of your card and just have the white cardstock behind it, but why not take advantage of the clear center and create a window card? So that's what I'm doing with this. I'm using the smallest of the two dies that I created the frame with to create the window. And then I'm taking my trimmer and I'm just cutting the Duralar just slightly smaller than the biggest of the two dies I used to create the window. I don't want to see any of the edges of this outside of that window, but I want to make sure it's big enough that I'm not seeing edges of it on the inside of the window. I'm using some 1/8 inch tape here. This is a nice strong double-sided tape, and I'm putting it around all of the edges. I want to make sure everything is glued down really well. You could use liquid glue for this. This is just going to dry, or this is just going to work a lot quicker. I don't have to wait for anything to dry. Once I have the tape around there, I can take the backing off, put it on my Duralar, and then I'm going to use that same tape to glue it to the front of the card. Doing the same thing, going around all four edges. I don't want to skimp out on this. I want to make sure it's around all four edges so everything is glued down. If you only put it in the corners, the sides of that frame are going to lift up and it's going to look a little bit odd. So take that backing off, and then I'm going to place it so that the center of this frame matches the opening that I've cut in my card there. And I'll typically choose one corner, line that up, and then line everything up, and it usually goes fairly quickly. I have a sentiment here that I created in one of my previous videos with this Betterpress set, and I'm just using that. So if you want to know how that was created, go to one of the two videos before this. I think it was the first one that I did with these plates, that you'll find how that was made there, and you'll find a lot more inspiration as well. For my third technique, I'm going to use Memento ink with the Betterpress plate. I am going to print it onto some hammer mill cardstock, and I am going to color with Copics. So I taped my hammer mill cardstock on the clear plate and inked that Betterpress plate with the Memento ink, and I'm putting it through the platinum machine for the pressure to press that image right into there. I will let that dry for a few seconds. It really doesn't need a ton of time, but I do want to make sure that is 100% dry before I start to color. I don't want those Copic markers to start to smear the ink in any way. So I have three colors that I'm using for the flower petals. I'm using V04, V06, and V09. I color my whole petal with the lightest color, and then I just kind of use a flicking motion to add the middle color, and then the same motion, but a little bit smaller, to add my darkest color. I'll work on a few petals at a time, working my way around the flower. So I always go light, medium, dark, and then I go back to the medium and back to the light. So same process for every single petal on this entire thing. I color my whole petal with the lightest color, flick in some of the medium color, and then flick in some of the darkest color, and then go back with the medium and blend between the medium and the dark, and then go over the entire thing with the lightest color. And the reason I'm doing a bit of a flicking motion with this particular image is because it's a flower petal, and it's going to look a little bit more like a natural way a flower petal would be shaded. I don't want to have kind of blobs of color. I want it to look a little bit more natural, and by kind of flicking it and having it heavier in the center and lighter where the tip of the brush has flicked up, it's just going to create a nicer blend, in my opinion. This may not be the way that everyone colors flowers with Copic or blends flowers with Copic. It's just the way that I like to do it. So again, these flowers can be colored in whatever colors you're wanting. I use Copic markers. I've used them for many, 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 many years. There are other alcohol ink markers on the market as well, and I'm sure the same technique would work with them as well. I just don't have them in order to be able to test it. Once you have something that works, you tend not to buy and test any other thing. So until these don't work for me, I'll just be using them and getting the most use out of them possible. But I really love how Copic markers blend. I love the fact that you can go back over the same area and reblend something if you want something a little bit darker, or if it didn't quite blend out. The one thing to keep in mind is these markers will blend a little bit more as they dry. So if you don't necessarily love them the second they're colored, give them a minute, let them dry. Chances are it'll blend out a little bit better. And sometimes if you walked away for a little while and then come back, it'll also look a little bit better. Sometimes when we're creating, we're a little bit too close to the project, and we're also our own worst critics. So for the leaves, for the tiny little leaves, I'm just going to use the lightest of the greens I have, and then for the larger leaves, I'll do 2 shades of green. So I'm using YG63 as well as G99. I'm coloring the entire large leaf with the lightest color and then flicking the dark color in and then going back over with the light color. And then some areas I thought weren't dark enough, or I lost some of the darkness, so I did go back in and flick some of that dark color in there. And for the center of the flowers, I'm using C05 and C07. The 07, I'm just putting some shadow around the outside edge of it. And for this one, I'm actually kind of just dotting that shadow in place just to kind of go with the texture that's already printed on that flower. I didn't really want to have too clean of a blend. And dotting that color to keep that texture just looks a little bit nicer. Those inks will dry fairly quickly for the center of the flowers because there's not a large area to them, and I didn't go over that ink too much. So once this is completely done, I did cut it down to 4 inches by 5 1/4, and then I'm going to use a little trick that I like to use to create a faux mat. Now this is a great trick if you want to not have too many layers on your card, or if you don't happen to have the perfect color. I'm choosing the darkest of the purples that I've used, and I'm going along the edge with the long side of the chisel edge of the marker. And it just creates a faux mat. It makes it look like there's a piece of purple cardstock underneath there, but it's not putting any extra layers there. I glued that to the front of the card, and then I chose one of the sentiments I made from one of my previous videos, and I am adding extra layers below there. I die cut them with some scrap cardstock. It's just a great way to add a little bit of dimension, to thicken that sentiment, to give it just a little bit more oomph, and a great way to use up a bunch of cardstock scraps. So I'm going to glue that to the center of the card. It ties in really nicely with the black color from the printing, as well as the gray from the center of the flowers. I'm using some stickles in the center of the flowers, and again, I'm just using that dotting motion. I'm not completely covering the center of the flowers. I'm just adding just a touch of sparkle there. Let that dry completely, and I love the way that looks. I love how vibrant alcohol inks are and how you can get some really cool looks. And I love the fact that you can also use them in different ways with the Betterpress system. If you have a favorite card or a favorite technique, put it in the comments below. I'm really curious what people love to see and what they're most inspired by. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a fantastic day.